In this lecture, we'll talk about game design, in particular in relation to the criteria, learning goals of the course, but also in general. So the organization of this lecture is: first we'll talk about game design and usability in relation to games. Then I will take some time to talk specifically about teaching or tutoring feedback and visualizations, because this is a central design area that you also have to work on in your project in some form. I will address also progress and variation. So these two other aspects are of course part of the total game design approach, but I also want to stress them as they are learning goals in the course, and you have to address them somehow in your project depending on what kind of project you end up doing. And the amount of teaching visualization versus progress design work you do, you can vary depending on where you go. I also at this time want to stress that in the course, any kind of game is possible to develop. You can even do a clone of an old game, but you need to do design work, so you cannot just simply copy everything, and you have to assume that just because a game was successful in the past doesn't mean it cannot be changed or improved. Many times, in order to make a great game, you actually have to take an old game and then change it a little bit to get to somewhere new. Don't assume that just because games in the past were successful, this is how we should do new versions of the same type of game. Also, I think you should assume that standard settings in many tools are not so good. For instance, the speeds that you get as a standard from using the physics engine when doing a jumper in Unity platforming, or in most games actually, will not be so great. So you have to really take time to make that a good feel for the game, and also so that the experience fits with the theme in the game, how fast, how slow the player should be. And many times I find that if you just used standard settings, you will get quite poor game controls. And there is a physiological concept that's called flow. This is a general concept. It's the zone of enchantment where we are at the optimum between something being too hard or confusing, or being too easy and therefore boring. And in this area, we tend as humans to exist when we have some skill situation where we can understand if we are doing things the right way or not. And so this is a general psychological phenomena, but they match games very, very good. And games are good when they're in the game mechanic zen zone here, the flow zone. And things can't be too easy, but they can't be too hard, or they cannot be confusing for the player. And this, of course, in games also will change as the player learns how the game works and develops skill. So the game flow also shows that a game must develop towards a more higher skill level, where you're actually required to manage higher difficulties, but you have to start quite low. Then, of course, there will be players who have a previous experience from similar games that will have a difficulty acceptance that is higher, not because of your game, but of previous games. And so you can start your difficulty level somewhere. Then you're actually assuming that players coming in to play your game are hardcore players that already have played many versions of the game you're doing. Finding ourselves in this zone is important, and we have to work hard to try to get our project to fit somewhere in between. We must also understand that in any kind of artistic or an emotional product, or where the experience is the entire package, there is the concept of the players or the user's willing suspension of disbelief, is that we want to engage ourselves in the activity, and we will get drawn into the activity and feel as if we are in it, achieve these flow scenarios, as long as we are not disturbed. But it's still a willing suspension, so the player can be disturbed in many ways and then get thrown out of this immersion into the game. So if we have poor controls, for instance, and the controls behave weirdly, this will always throw the player out of the willing suspension, and you will lose the engagement. If visuals are distracting, like from multiple themes that don't work together, so if you have ghosts and then all of a sudden you have a lot of candy-oriented graphics, it might clash with one another, and we get disturbed and throw out. If we get not enough interaction feedback from the system, we get confused by the system, and this confusion will throw us out of this area where we want to be. Players want to be suspended into a disbelief world where they're watching a fantasy and partaking in that. But when we disturb them, they kind of lose focus on that. And that's something in gaming, there's always the idea about what the experience would work like. The idea we have in our mind of how the experience and interaction should be. This is the idea of the ads of the Wii gameplay, where everyone is playing like real sport, moving their bodies, and it's so super fun, and we're doing it together. This is what we want. However, with the rules of the game, the interaction, the way things work actually lead to a real experience. And in particular, when there's a gaming system with scoring and an optimal way to play a system, that reality will actually go towards the most efficient, most best way. Not the way that you think it's intended to be played, the game, but the way the game is actually played the easiest. And here is the reality of many Wii games. It was sometimes even, you had higher level of controls playing the games very fixed in the sofa, just flicking your hand a little bit. And so there's a conflict between the idea of the game and the reality of the game, and the reality will always win. This is what we have to make great, the reality of the experience, rather than the idea of the experience. As players, that's why it's also so important to do playtesting and to watch people actually play your game. It can be hard to have that amount of playtesting that would be required, but that's where the reality will be show itself when other people play your game that don't have that vision in their head about how the game should be played. One core design philosophy for games is that you should never stop the game experience, because people want to play games. They come to games to play, so they don't want to read, for instance, instructions. They don't want to stop to watch a particular dialogue that's quite long, unless it's actually the core center of the game, or there might be some people who actually want to play a story-based game. But in general, there is always the need for a skip button in situations where it actually means that players want to play rather than not play. And tutorials inside games where it's clear that a level is a tutorial becomes one of these things. It's actually not a game. So you're cheating the player, and they feel that they're not playing the game. And that's not what they want to do. So you have to create your game so that you're always trying to play the game, and nothing is really stopping the experience. When you're doing even cutscenes, they can be designed in such a way that they are short enough, integrated enough, and give enough information for the game that you actually feel that they're contributing. This is very difficult, and it's very uncommon that we see that in many games. And sometimes games can have some story that's actually disturbing, but it's so short all the time, and it creates a sense of progression, so it's okay, but in principle it's actually not okay. Remember, the player wants to play the game. The other thing that most people don't want to do is think. So they don't want to figure out how your game works. They want to kind of naturally understand it. And here is also a challenge for us design-wise. Players can figure out games, but in general doesn't want to. They want it to be obvious. They don't want to read the manual. They don't want to read the fucking manual. They want the game to be easy to understand. So we want to play the game but they don't want to think how to play the game. So this is a bit of a conflict for us. We must create some kind of game experience where during ordinary gameplay we also understand the depth of the game, and all those little actions that we do that's also directed towards making us understand how to play a game should be real game, and should not require us to think. So it means that there can't really be hidden rules that we can't see, that we have to figure out in the general case. Now, for all of these design principles, there's always a game that has thinking as its core game mechanic. And in that case, of course, the player wants to think. That's why they're consuming this. But if you think about a platforming game, you don't want to guess what to do. You want to move forward. And this has been more difficult in some games where it's part of the game story, like an exploration game. It's actually part of the game mechanic that you might end up in situations where you don't know what to do. And then there is this line where the player has to think too much to figure it out. And nowadays, this can be solved a little bit by going onto YouTube to search for how to play the game. But in reality, this is where we're actually losing a little bit on this game principle, where the player should always kind of know what to do in the general case, and maybe more not be able to do it because they don't have enough skill yet, or their character doesn't have enough stamina, and they have to go and change that, do other things in the game to get to a place where they can actually do the things they know they want to do. Nobody wants to read the manual, though games might require you to be instructed about complex rule sets. People don't really want to. They want to understand as much as possible. So this should be our design goal. Nobody should have to read the manual. We want to integrate the manual into the experience. And this doesn't mean giving instructions as part of the game, but it might mean giving a reward, a chest, which in it contains an object, which enables a rule in the game, which you then can explain, because then it's an item that you get, and that item activates a rule in the game, and that means we're interested in the magic of the item you're receiving. So there's ways around this to create an instructional loop that doesn't feel like a manual, but feels part of the activity. And this must also, of course, be tailored to certain game experiences, like in a space shooter. You will be likely to want to read much, much less than in an adventure game, in a Zelda-style adventure game. But even there, you actually don't want to read so much. You want to see, experience, pick things up, understand what they are, try them out, figure it out yourself, as far as we can go. And this is an important design criteria. So for every game, in particular complex games, it might be the case that we cannot reach that level. That's when we start adding instructions on top of the first version of the game. But when we talk about the game rules in a computer game, people don't want to read about how the game works. They want to discover it by playing the game. One of the core aspects of making it so that the player can understand the game is making rules in the game visible, to make them take visible form. Here is a typical item for that. In a tower defense game, we typically show the radius of a tower, how far can it reach. So this creates a visible rule explanation where we can see the impact, the strategic impact on putting a tower on a particular position. Now I have to click on the different towers to see their rules, but the reach that they have is directly visible inside the game. And this is what we have to do when we are talking about our game rules in general. Find ways to make those appear visually in the graphical user interface during the normal game experience. Another, perhaps a little bit confusing game design principle is making it easy for the player to perform. But take an example. jumping and turning in the air, doing a double jump in the air, being able to control where you're landing by steering and affecting the player in the air, which is totally illogical. It's not possible in reality. Or cars going backward and forward at the same speed, so that doesn't really matter, but real cars cannot go forward that fast, or backward as fast as they can go forward. They actually used to be cars that could go extremely fast backwards, but that's very dangerous because of the way the wheels are set up inside cars. But in a game, having cars going naturally slow when backing up becomes really, really boring. And so, because all of these limitations or these ways that we change the way that it realistically would work, actually makes it easier for the player to play. So if you can turn in the air, or if you can double jump even though you're in the air, that means the player can do more advanced jumps. They can jump with more precision because they can steer the character in for longer periods of time. The only consequence of this is that the levels can be harder. That it's possible for a player to play a harder level. And so that means the levels become more interesting, rather than having to start the levels really, really trivial because of the realistic jumping. So this kind of making it easy to perform actually makes it possible to have more interesting gameplay rather than having less gameplay. And it only really changes the way our levels are constructed and where our starting point is in terms of complexity. And this is good because players want to play at kind of a skill level. They want to play more visually interesting game mechanics, and so we can give them that. And then we can increase the difficulties even more. Here's another example where a game would make it easy for the player to perform. This is from Tom Clancy's Splinter Cell. So you're playing an agent, and he's an agent, but of course you are not. You're just a normal game player. So you don't have these magical abilities that he has. But in this game, you could mark characters for shooting them. And then you have to shoot the first one. But if you're able to shoot the first one, the character will automatically also shoot the next one. So it's kind of rewarding you for performing one action by giving you the next action. And that makes you feel very, super agent-like. And you're able to do interesting things, even though it would be much harder for you as a person. And so the visual effect is much more interesting than if you would have to do these moves manually, and you will come out feeling the experience will be much more James Bond-ish. Here is another example of this from Splinter Cell, which is also used in other games. So the character has originally been standing to the right, where there is a ghost image of the character. So this means we know where we were last seen by the enemies. We know what position we had. And so we're able to position ourselves strategically in relation to this position. And this gives us much more memory and sense of 3D, and enables us to wait for the enemies to appear and maybe take care of them. And we can imagine an agent doing this, but in reality we would not ourselves be able to do that. And it's the visualization of our previous location where we were detected that enables this, actually making the game easier to play, and therefore more visually interesting scenarios can be achieved for players. In Super Meat Boy, another really hard platformers, deadly hard platformers, that is its own kind of game genre. By making the levels really, really short, the games can be really, really hard. A very quick replay loop where you die, you start over instantly, very close to where you are. So the amount of checkpoints or save points you have in a game experience, how far back you will go in a level, actually dictates how difficult jumps can be without the experience becoming frustrating. The opposite example exists in a game like Hollow Knight, where when you die, you can always go back and find your dead soul, collect all your money, but it might be very, very far off. And quickly this becomes very tedious. Now there is a reward at the end, but still you have to overcome a lot of problems, you have to replay a lot, but actually you're feeling punished all the time. Many times I feel that the mix between the long distance between where you died and where you respawn is affecting the experience negatively. I get frustrated by the game. In Super Meat Boy, the shortness enables the difficulty. So the shorter distance you have between save points, the higher your death rates and your amount of death in the game can be. Super Meat Boy also has this interesting final visualization of all the game versions that you played before you finish the levels. You can see all your attempts at once. This becomes kind of a fun video for you to see. And the more you've died on a level, the more rich this experience becomes. So it's actually kind of counter rewarding you a little bit for all the bad times you're doing. You get to see it much more. If you're kind of making the level on the first try, this video will not be as full of life and rewarding as if you have actually died a lot of times. So it kind of compensates for the hardness and softens the blow when you've not been playing so. One important aspect of game design is that not all players are the same. Not everyone has the same motivation or interest in a game. There is the Bartle test that kind of identifies players along 4 axes of achievers, explorers, socializers, and killers, where their predominant interest in the game is to either kill others, achieve goals, explore environments, or socialize with others. This is just one model for different types of players, and I've seen others where there is a 7-category design. The important part is to understand that not everyone wants to play the game the same way, and you have to pick some of these and focus on them. It's very hard to create a game experience which is appreciated by many. It's more optimal in reality to try to get a game experience that really satisfies one category and then try to make it a global game instead for that subset of all players. It's easier to really, really satisfy them. And this is more important in a global competition than such as game development for game platforms. So you should really try to think about that. What kind of motivational or game desire am I catering to, and change your entire game experience to that. Super Meat Boy, of course, caters to the achievers that are interested in playing the game as good as possible. And so we have to move forward with that and make it really hard to achieve. And meaning that if you achieve in a game, you're actually good at playing the game. Explorers want a different type of experience. They want richness rather than difficulty. So if you make the game difficult, you will actually make a less enjoyable experience for them, and you have to focus instead on change and variation and difference in the game experience. For a couple of years now, 2D graphics has come back as a really, really core activity. I think Unity, who started out as a 3D engine, polled their users and found out that 80% of all game projects were 2D. And we have been for a long time seeing a revival of pixel art, 2D graphics. I think there are a number of reasons for that, but one of them being that in many cases the two-dimensional graphical space actually is more beautiful, and it's much easier to make mistakes in the 3D graphics to make the graphics look poor. And now the support, of course, is growing all the time, and now it's possible, but the two-dimensional is actually more natural for us. There's even science showing that we don't really have full 3D perception. We have kind of a 2.5D perception, we see images and we move in time, and that's how we are able to move around in a 3D world. But we don't really have a full 3D perception. And of course, this is better in some people and less good in others. Strategic elements is much easier to discover in a two-dimensional space than in a three-dimensional space. But of course, some game experiences don't really work in 2D, but I would say that many times the experience will be better in a two-dimensional space than in a three-dimensional space, unless the game actually requires 3D in the experience. And then, of course, you cannot do it with 2D. Another reason why 2D might be a bit more preferable nowadays is that we have gotten games into a much more physics and simulation-wise complex environment where we are simulating basically everything. Simulation requires our brain to calculate forward in time what's going to happen for us to be able to make the landings of everything where we need to be in the game in order not to die by the simulation. And this complexity of that physics is much lower in 2D than in 3D. So it's much easier for us to anticipate where things are going to end up in a 3D space. And in particular when we're playing towards a smaller screen compared to running around and playing football in the real world. So 2D makes it easier for us to have more complex, more realistic and live environments where physical simulation is actually affecting us. So if we have moving platforms that are physically simulated and will move according to collisions, gravity and other things, then 2D is super important because of the mind. The player is able to cope with a higher level of physics and simulation in 2 dimensions. Most games also cater to some portion of the human senses, so it might be the eye-hand coordination, the ability to control a stick keyboard, to get the character to go somewhere, to having situational awareness where you keep track of multiple objects at the same time and figure out where they're going to go, or mental challenges like remembering large maps. And it's important to understand which part is the primary for your game and try to focus on that, because the experience will be stronger the fewer of these you're actually challenging. And you will have eye-hand coordination abilities, but if learning large maps is part of your kind of platformy like game world, you should probably have a little bit less advanced jumps challenges, because that will kind of conflict with remembering where to go. So if you don't want to focus on that, you should always provide very clear initiative to where you are on the maps and where you want to go, because then you can focus more on the actual jumping to be the core aspect of your game. Many times there's a lot of risk in focusing on more than one thing. So try to figure out what your game is aiming mostly for and then go even deeper into that and maybe reduce some of the challenges on the other areas of our human senses. Many gamers, game developing companies kind of live in a world where they're developing for a known platform. This was very clear when the Microsoft Kinect sensors, the Wii games came out, because there was a new interaction control. And it's still very clear in many of the VR or AR experiences that are being developed at this current time. Now the game controls, the interaction controls, actually define what kind of gameplay will be good at that. So there is a clear indication in mobile games that those games that are actually successful are those that use multi-touch to a good advantage rather than button tapping, because they fit there, and this kind of controls the game experience. This is something you don't so often see in the game design theory, because they're kind of operating from an area where the game genre is already defining the interaction. But when you're doing things for a mobile platform or a surf pad, you have to think about this as your target platform and make a game that works with multi-touch. And when you're using typical first-person shooters, is almost always better on PC, and moving them to console is much harder, whereas vehicle control might be much better on that stage. So different kind of game mechanics work well with different interaction mechanics, and you should here focus again on one of them and make that one core of your game and change your game design to fit the platform that you're aiming for and to make the best out of that. And then you will see what happens in the future. Some game types work on 2 platforms, but I think many times it's rather the exception to the rule than something that you can achieve for all games. Having a single core gameplay mechanic that is at the center of your game, I think is a good way to make it much easier to design a great experience. Because there is a risk when you have multiple gameplay elements that they will start conflicting with one another. And that becomes a risk for the project. We did have, for instance, a student project where mixing one-to-one fighting with strategic army gaming, so like a Risk strategic board game combined with physical gameplay. And it actually turned out that having only one unit made it easier to win the battles than having a large amount of units. And that sort of counter invent worked against the strategic placement of troops and kind of removed the strategic element a little bit. Continuity here is a Swedish game that won prize awards. You would have strategic positioning of these tiles to solve a puzzle, and then you would go in and run inside the puzzles. And at some times it would be that these two didn't work so well together, but it was kind of a puzzle, but you had to go outside and inside, and that would affect the experience. And there's a risk there. Now in continuity's format, it kind of worked, but I saw it as sort of just on the edge of working. Because the strategic and the reactive many times, I think, doesn't work so well together. And reactive gameplay tends to take over. And if you have a strategic game idea, you don't want to put in too much reactive gameplay into it, because we trigger on that. More players kind of trigger on the reactive game part than the strategic. So if you want to do strategic, don't add reactive. And it's possible to create a Unity mixing multiple core gameplay, but I think generally it doesn't work, and it's much better. And the theory of game design also say that you should focus on a single core game activity and develop that rather than trying to do multiple things at the same time. In general, there is kind of consistency about almost all game activities requiring some kind of skill. So doing what you do in a game should require you to be good at something in some way. And that doesn't have to be extremely good, but if you just click, that, and it doesn't require you to do anything, that should not be, does not mean that it will be an interesting and engaging game activity. In fact, the theory is that more skill will create more engaging experiences. But of course, we must remember that there are different player types. So for instance, explorers, their skill is to play maybe a lot and to remember and read lore and understand the system, not to achieve the actual movement of the character on the map in fast succession. So there's kind of a different set of skills that you're catering to, and you have to avoid adding skill requirements on another level. The reason I put this Fruit Ninja video from the old Kinect games up here is because Fruit Ninja was one of the few games out there for Kinect that actually required skill to play, and this is why it was actually successful. Not just because the interaction worked with the controls, but also because in many other games you would get points without playing dance games, for instance, on Kinect, and I guess on other platforms as well. You could dance or sit still and still get points in the game, and that kind of kills the experience because it makes it non-authentic. So skill is required. theoretically in most games, there has to be some challenge to what you do. Now there are cookie clicker games where you just click on cookies, but the skill there is to click very fast many times and then start clicking on other places, and so at some point it kind of works. There can be a local skill in being able to do things in time, even though there is no real mental depth in terms of skill. So it can be a pure control-oriented skill, but still there needs to be some kind of challenge for it to become really engaging. Perfection is an important part of game design, where you create a small but very well-working experience. The game should work at all times. This is something to really go for, and it's a grading criteria for the course. So you have a whole game, with startup scene, loading scene menus and stuff like that, and that doesn't take so much time to build, but really impacts the game experience. Your menu should also be used to instruct the player as a way of making the game experience better, because then you're more quickly moving into that. You want your controls to work at all times, never fail, always feel good. And you must have content that matches with one another, so that you have a theme. Like if you have pirates, they should all look piratey somehow. There should be a very clear core gameplay, what it is you're doing in the game. This should be very directly and easy to understand, and focus then on one particular type of gameplay for the course. And then you work with this all the time. And the key to perfection is to get a small project so you can get it to play test with other players, so you can understand how to go forward and do iterations on playtesting. If you don't do that, it's often the case that you don't get a very perfect experience. And there's also having to spend a lot of time. Remember, half the time has to go to polishing of your product development, so you have to plan accordingly. Progression. So progression is the way that the game develops in terms of complexity, difficulty, range, variation, how much it grows. And from this also comes a sense of development, going from easy to hard. But at some point, the progression must go from a pick-up-and-play scenario to a full game experience. But after that, you go into maybe more variation, where you have achievements by the player, and the player character grows as a character goes up in level and so forth, but the game challenge or difficulty doesn't grow. So the progression is really this kind of issue about how the game develops from an easy to get into experience into a more full, a bit more challenging experience. And you might also have a linear. The question is how this progression should also work. And if you think back to the flow model, where you have the finding the sweet spot between something that's too difficult and too easy and therefore boring. Many times we can talk about there is naturally going to be a logarithmic development here. So in the beginning, you have to go from quite simple to quite difficult very fast. And then the gameplay in itself and the abilities of the actions can pan out and be at a certain level where you could actually play the game for a very, very long time. The game doesn't have to get any harder. But on that way, you must also have some kind of jagged development, so that, for instance, when you achieve something difficult for a short period of time, you will get a segment of the game that is quite easy after that. And this is just to enhance the player's development. And so you want to create a jagged logarithmic development line of complexity. Now, progression can come from many things. So it can come, for instance, from a playing character having a limited abilities, like not being able to double jump or wall jump, and then later on you get the wall jump and double jump, and then the levels require you to do wall jumping, and so now your player is having a more complex and more challenging set. And then also the levels become harder with more requiring you to do more precise jumps or time jumps where time challenges will kind of kill you if you don't make them. But then you come to a plateau in many times and you get a difficulty level where you want to stay. So think about Tetris for a while. So like Tetris has a time-based increasing speed, and the game gets harder and harder because it goes faster and faster. But there is in reality a level where most people would want to play forever, and it would be sufficiently interesting, but it wouldn't get any better if it goes up. Now, when the speed increases, it actually just kills you. And there's a few people in the world that can play at really, really high levels, but they are so few. Now, there's still skill involved, so people like that, but in reality, I would say that designing Tetris like that today, I'm a bit uncertain about how well that would succeed in the game. And also because time is the engine of the progression, it gets harder and harder to introduce new elements inside Tetris, making it difficult actually to even add even one or two pieces to the game. So that means the game is actually very limited. Now, progression is also sometimes used in order to describe the development of the game world or the game character in different level systems moving forward. But that's not what I think about in the game design course when we talk about progression so much. I'm thinking more about these initial stages where you go from a pick up and play, a little bit more easy game mechanical situation into a more full game feel. But then you also need these development-oriented goals where the player would have in the beginning a small hut, then a bigger house, and then a mansion, and so on. And this is more the motivational progression and development of the character that makes you want to play the same game longer by achieving these things. And these are more motivational dimensions, and those are not really for the level of the game development that we are in this course. We want to see more this user experience oriented design issue of making the game go from something that everyone can start playing into a more full game experience over some period of time. Now, following this course with a successful game, you would also want to develop the progression of the character in the game so that you would have a lot of levels that would be interesting to play, more as a sense of moving forward and keep playing basically the same game for a long time because you're growing a world of some kind. So in the course, I want you to demonstrate instead different levels of difficulty, challenge, or variation or complexity in the game, rather than creating a lot of levels that are kind of basically at the same challenge level, but where the player would want to play the game, earn money, and use that money to buy something. That is for a later stage in development. Tetris is actually a good example of a game where it's hard to make a more complex game that actually makes the game more interesting. So, and this of course is related to the fact that Tetris is driven by an increase of time and the speed. Adding more components makes it harder to remember how to play the game. And so the skill is then reduced from a reactive, like quickly determining what to do, into a memory game where you are actually trying to remember more than you would naturally be able to do. So building 3D Tetris with more components and stuff like that, most of the time it actually makes the game work less well, and people don't really play that. So there is this scenario where the progression and challenge, where you try to increase the game, you actually hit a roof ceiling somehow, and the game gets poorer because of it. And if you do that in your game, and you can show us how you've tried that, then we will be extremely impressed. But if you just say that it's a game where things are too hard to play anymore, challenging, then we don't get so impressed. So anyways, that's about that. Coming into teaching visualization and feedbacks, which is a grading criteria and part of the design challenge. How do you let your player understand the rules of the game through the game experience? And this is where you want to see how you can portion out use the progression system, for instance, to give the controls during a play experience. So you can give some of it in the beginning and then later more. So you're using time as a way to teach the player. You give the player rewards, and these rewards are actually some instructional content towards playing the game, understanding what's important in the game. You can mix story and the instruction of how to play the game and what to do in the game as in a good way. So the story is always dominant and the player is actually feeling the story. And I think many times this is actually the best way to give story, even though it can be hard to do in the long run, where the story is actually meaningful for the player, giving you hints on where to go, what to do. This is quite uncommon. Instead, the game is many times giving you lore, history, kind of settings about why you are where you are. And this is why they invented the skip button, because many players don't want to play this, but it's not really that they don't want, it's that it's conflicting with playing the game, because it's not adding anything to the ability to play the game, was the primary objective of the player. People don't want to read when playing, they want to have short amounts of text. But I also think that many times one of the problems with instructional text is the size. So text is very small and visual game experiences are very large. So if text was much larger, it might actually work much better. But there is a natural combination here, because very large text cannot be very long. But so integrating text into the environment, making it really big at the same level as the graphics in many games, I think would make it work much better. But in general, there's also this idea that we don't want to read instructions, we want to play a game. So you have to work with this and try to find good ways to teach using the visuals and graphics and the feedback from the game. Anything that you do that is just a pure instruction, text about the rules, a tutorial level where you're trying to learn to play the game, is outside of this scope. And the grading criteria as to how well playing the game actually teaches the player how to play the game. Here's a good example of text integrated into the game environment in a good way. Here the goal of the player to infiltrate the mansion, which is the current challenge, is lit up on the buildings of the street in the town where the player is moving. So you can always see what to do, and therefore you can always remember what your goal is. You don't have to go into a menu to see this. And this is large, so it's the same scale as the rest of the graphics, making it easier to consume, and also integrated into the environment. It's kind of a decoration. And since we have these kind of light festivals sometimes, it also feels like something we are familiar with. But in reality, I think that the fact that you put these kind of textual decorations that work graphically with the game into the game, that means you can instruct the player in an interesting way. Have you ever played Bastion, developed, by the way, for Monogame? There is a great integration of a story instruction mix, where, especially in the beginning, the narrative voice tells the player a lot of things, but those things are also instructions of what the player should do. And so he would start off by telling you that the character wakes up in his bed and gets out of bed, and so your character is lying there, and then the story waits until you actually move your character out of bed, and then as you walk you trigger new story elements. Oh, he sees his old friend, the battle axe from before, and he runs to get it. And so the story who talks about this boy also instructs you what to do, but when you do these actions, it also advances the story, and there's a mix between what's been happening, but also directions of what you should do in the game in a very natural way. And so this kind of combination is interesting. Storytelling in audio is really great because it can coexist with the game experience. The biggest problem is generally that telling a story and having a player doing something else at the same time actually is conflicting, and we stop listening. In particular, if important instructions are hid inside long winding talks or long dialogue, that makes it even harder for the player to pick up. But not having that, I think that audio is a really interesting channel for instructions in games, because they are possible to coexist with a player that's still moving around in a game world. Just hinting about the controls that you use in a game is a good way to kind of teach without over-teaching. So here we show this game shows the controls, arrow keys and spacebar. What does spacebar do? Well, in this case, of course, it's jumping, and the arrow keys move, so it's a standard design, so it's very easy to understand. But if you would add an E or an R key here, you would show that these keys exist and you know which you should use. And so then the player can figure it out for themselves. We don't have to explain what these keys do necessarily. A big challenge in the design of teaching the rule set is, of course, our perception and the way the game works. If we have a very fast-paced game with dangers all around us, this will clearly impact. Now, in this game, of course, we can see our ammo, our health level, our armory. We have all the data in place, but in reality, we'll see in the next slide how this actually works. So in a real game scenario, our player actually isn't seeing all that data. Because of the fast-paced game and the dangers ahead, your field of view gets reduced a lot and you stop seeing all that data that's on the edges of the game screen. So it's only your friends that can see your data. And this becomes, a problem, because when you have low ammo, low armor, you're not really aware of this. And if you want that kind of information to be at the heart of the game, and the player should actually always know, you have to put it inside the center of the focus of attention, or like having progress bars on top of enemies, or having them on your weapons, so you actually always see at least something. And this is also the reason why when you start getting critical, you see flashing red signals all over the screen, because nobody can actually understand that. And it's also one of the reasons why we don't have linear health system in many games nowadays. Instead, you quickly go to a relatively low health scenario, but then you have a lot of stamina before you actually die. And in some games you can't even die, but you have this kind of stressed out experience. And this is because it also takes time for me to realize that I'm in a critical state. So if I then get killed by the next hit, this is actually something that will be too punishing for me. And I will kind of not understand this until it's actually too late, and it's not really fair. Which is, in fact, dependent on the fact that we don't have a natural feeling of being in a critical state, because we're sitting in a sofa playing a game. So it's important to remember how the human senses work in critical situations where you want to communicate the state of the game, and what you're actually able to see in a game situation. Here's an example of a game built in the course where you were playing this ball, and this ball would roll around in the world. Then it would hit the right arrow, and as it did, it picked up the right arrow. So it actually gained the ability to go to the right. And that means we can make abilities or controls in the game, objects in the game world, and then it becomes super trivial to teach the player what they are. And in this game, you would have to have 3 different abilities, and then you would have to throw your abilities into the world in order to be able to use a different ability and then pick up again that ability, and becomes part of the integrated puzzle. But this kind of highlights how we can make our abilities in the game into items that we use in the game. And when they're items in the game world, they become much more interesting than if they are only standard controls. Of course, if we have a very basic standard setup, arrow keys and space to jump, but maybe 1 button to shoot, then we don't have to go to these lengths until we want to make it like our core game idea, which was in this game called Knapsack. A good example of a really great hint is this glinting hint in Bejeweled, where you will temporarily highlight something that's possible for you to do, but might actually not be the optimum. So when you're trying to figure out where you have a 3-in-1 combination by moving something, and if you take a little bit too long time for that, the game will create a hint and make you kind of see an option. But the good thing is that this is not perhaps the optimal option, it's just one of the possible options. And maybe sometimes you don't see where the hinting was, so you just see that it was in the upper left corner, upper right corner. So you limit the amount, and then you can search for the solution over there, and then maybe all of a sudden you see it. And so this way the hint isn't really removing the entire game, while still enabling you to see options that maybe you didn't see before. Rewards in games can also be instructions. So by giving away controls, having a chest that you open, and inside the chest there's a message, and that message actually tells you something about the game. These kinds of events are very strong compared to just having an instruction popping up. So it's actually the player who achieves something or moves towards and chooses to open a chest, and this triggers, especially if it has some graphical, visual, interesting effect and sound and audio, and interest in consuming what's coming out. And of course this cannot be a long winding thing, but this is a way for us to provide instructions for the game that the player is interested in. And that's something you can do. Many games here I have Crash Bandicoot, because in Crash Bandicoot you earn double jump abilities when you defeat the first boss, at least in one of the games. And so this is a way to give controls to the player to change the game, but also to make the player interested in the ability by giving it as a reward. End screens are of course good places to demonstrate rules. Here is a game that we developed for a gravity-oriented spatial planet arrangement game, and there were particles flying around affected by gravity, and the challenge was to move the planets into good positions. And so we would have merges, orbits, and ricochets, and you would get scores from that. So here you can, from the statistics, see that things are relevant. So even though you didn't understand it from the beginning, you can understand that achieving orbits is a goal in the game. And I have 0 orbits, so maybe I should try to make orbits. So the results of a gameplay session where the player ends up getting a level end screen, that is a place where we can actually demonstrate some of the rules. So this means we need to start off with the player being able to play the game in a simple way, but then we use the data that we're presenting to the player as the player ends some portion of the game in a way to describe important game rules of the deeper gameplay inside the game. Loading screens are often places where games put tips on how to play the game. And the problem with loading screens is that they signal a waiting period in the play session. So players are zoning out of the game, waiting for the game to start again. So there is no real interaction from the player that triggers the loading, and this makes the tip less obvious. Of course, the loading screen is a continuous place in the game, so using it to provide tips is really good and super fine. But it's not a place where you can count on the player being really interested in reading the tip and understand. You have to understand that many players will ignore this text because they are kind of waiting. They're not in a state where they're interested in consuming a message from you. They're waiting for the game to start. Pick up and play is a design criteria or a way to say that the game should be so easy you could just spend a few seconds to kind of get your bearings and then start playing. This means you have to give controls, the minimal amount of needed controls in the beginning, away to the player quite quickly by demonstrating it somehow. and then show the player in which direction to go by using something that's running in that direction, or positioning the camera so it's easy to understand in which direction to go. Use enemy flow or coins to direct the player. Now the player is up and running, is playing, then you can start thinking about adding. So to some extent, this pick up and play means making the game easy to understand and grasp, and quickly, without instructional text and understanding, demonstrate the controls, but then also to cut away a lot of things in the game in the beginning so the player can get into the game experience quickly, and then for a later stage in the game add more components. And the ability to pick up and play something is important in terms of simplifying the initial game experience and making a game experience portioned in time. But it's also an important aspect because people will try games, then they will stop playing them if they don't understand what to do, how to control the player. So this is very important. And this is something that you can very easily test for, because it's very quick to understand whether or not people actually get playing quickly in your game or not by observing them, if you don't give them any instructions when testing your game. It's also important to remember that the player has a development process of their own when getting into a new game. So in the first period, they need to get excited. Something must be fun for them to even start trying the game. And this might actually happen currently today outside of the game, in YouTube or in a Steam loading download screen where you're seeing videos from the games. But even in the game, you want to get excited even when you start, before you start playing. So this might be using the menu to create ambiance, environmental ideas, or initial phases where you see some dramatic effects or something happening, which you get forced into. Sometimes this is counterintuitive with interaction, because some games try to make you start by playing a character and trying to play a sequence that's very controlled, so that would be an interactive experience. But I think many times people might feel forced to do something bad, and this creates a bad sense. But creating some kind of drama very quickly can help you get excited. And we have to remember that, because you need to be excited about the game. The next step is really the control learning portion for the player. So now the player is mentally challenged by understand how to act in the game. So we can't throw a lot of story and strategic important elements and complex goals for the rule sets of the game onto the player at that state. We have to allow them a short period of time where they just learn how to move the character in the world before we get to anything else. We have to remember that phase. Then there is the goal learning phase, where the player understands the basic winning points, what you get points for, what you do, how this affects the things. And those are still at the core level. But now we know how to control the character, and now we have to know how to win in the game. And then after that, we can have this next step, how to be strategic in the game, how to play in smart ways. How do we avoid traps? How do we move in different directions to go around? And so when we have that kind of depth in a game, which is really interesting, we also have to remember that the player will go through all these phases. So we have to wait a little bit, allow them to move around and be active in the world before getting into like goal learning or even more strategic gameplay. And this is central to all game experiences, but there is an exception to the rule, and it's if you're developing a hardcore game for hardcore gamers that are actually playing kind of a clone. So they have already done this, they're already excited about the game type because they usually play it. They understand the controls because they are standard for the player, and they understand what the goals are because they are learned signals from other game experiences. So this is something that we can use to our advantage by copying existing games. The problem is many times that you're reducing the amount of players that they can actually get into a game But for some game experiences, you can do that, and then you should probably go even further with that. One of the challenges also for game development is to look out for difficulty spikes where you have very challenging portions in the game too early. Principally, maybe requiring strategic behavior when the player haven't gotten much further than into the control learning phase of the experience. So there is importance to test for that and to avoid difficulty spikes really early in the game experience. Having a minimal control set is a good thing to design for. Now, with minimal, we don't mean trivial controls, but the minimal amount of controls you require for the kind of gameplay that you have. And you should always strive towards having fewer controls. But you might sometimes want to duplicate controls. So like you can have an AWSD steering control for the keyboard, but you should probably also have arrow keys. So in that case, you're actually duplicating the controls, but you should try to avoid them and see if you can remove controls in order to create it. Because control, like the use of the control is a skill, and the fewer you have, the more advanced use of those few controls you can have in the gameplay. The other option could be to have a few basic, very fundamental controls and then combination keys for that is different, and this will completely transform the game. If you have like more than 7 buttons, or even more than 5 buttons, it becomes really complicated. And you also have to think about controls, whether or not you have to move your hands when playing. One of the combos I see sometimes is people mixing mouse and keyboard, but actually just using the mouse for some button pressing. And in those scenarios, I would want to avoid the mouse completely and to use only keyboard, because then the hands can stay at one place. At other points, you really need the mouse and the keyboard combo, and then that's what you should do. A good example of simplifying the controls can maybe be found in Little Big Planet, which in the Little Big Planet 3 had 3-dimensional movement, but the 3-dimensional movement was always moving between 2D planes. So the player would move as a 2D game in one plane, but then use interaction to shift in which 2D plane they were. And so it created a depth and enabled puzzles that required you to go in different parts in a 3D world, but you didn't have full 3D movement, and it simplified the movement, made the movement more puzzle-oriented rather than full interaction. In the course, we have a requirement on consistency and identity, and the focus of using graphics, for instance, and audio to connect into a single theme, unified experience. But other than that, the graphics is not a criteria in the course, and you can use, hand-drawn, very rough graphics, or you can download and use graphics. The only thing I want you to work with is that all the graphics fit within the same theme or identity, and that is a consistency throughout the game project in your case. If you have a pirate themed game, all things in the game should kind of reflect the piratey theme. When designing a more strategic game, we want the player to be careful and have skillful thinking. So this is our core ability. We want planning, decision-making, discovery, those kinds of things. But it's but it might be easy to create those rules. The biggest challenge is to make those rules visible graphically in the game experience so that they have a physical form that the player can discover. If they don't have a visual form, the player is going to have to experience them over a long time, and this makes it very, very hard. So how do you make the game economy visual in your game? This is one of the core elements of strategic games. We have to think about how to develop them so that the player can actually see more of the underlying rule sets to become more interested in and be able to play at a higher level. In an action-oriented game, like a top-down shooter, maybe a bullet hell shooter where you're trying to survive. This is a reactive experience, and we want the player to use the controls and kind of keep track of the environment and fly into the right way. Here, the problem is how the speed of the game will affect the perception of the player and how to use that both to hide enemies, but also to create and move enemies in ways that means that the player will discover them and be able to see them, beforehand. So one of the interesting things about our peripheral vision is that movement, we are trained to see movement, but color, detail, and form, we don't really see in the peripheral field. So enemies far off from the player's focus needs to move from side to side in order to become visible. And we can both use this to make the player see enemies or hide enemies in the game experience. Action-oriented games are kind of one of the biggest game genres. An action-adventure game where the character is running around and there is kind of a story related to that. There might be a world, there's puzzles or things you should do in order to advance. And a lot of the reason why this is interesting for us is that we are motivated by the fact that we have a character that we're playing and advancing. But then there is this challenge between how to make the story valuable to the gameplay so that the story is actually adding to the game experience, or that at least it's not really conflicting with the player and making the player having to wait a lot. Another issue that's common in action-adventure games is kind of open-ended world designs or getting lost syndromes, where you're playing and you have a big world and you don't know what to do. But part of the action-adventure experience is to kind of discover also where to go. One of the biggest problems in game design here is that you might not play the entire game in one session, and so you might not remember where to go. Now, currently, many action-adventure games actually lean heavily, I think, on YouTube videos and other people playing walkthroughs of the game. And it turns out that when you can have really complicated puzzle things in action-adventure games, but at the same time, this kind of leads to just scrolling out, going to YouTube and figuring it out, and so you can't really play the action-adventure game anymore. We played Zelda Breath of the Wild. And there is some weird shrines there where you have to really, really try for a very long time. Just imagining being able to figure out how to play these on your own doesn't really work. And it turns out at the end, you're kind of going through YouTube, checking out how to do everything. And that kind of kills the adventure part for me. So that's, I think, a bit of a challenge. So even though you can manage that kind of getting stuck issue, that also becomes still a problem for the game experience. It kind of kills it, removes the adventure part for the player. So there's a fine balance here of making an action-adventure game where the gamer controls where to go, but still remembers what to do in a world that is a bit open-ended and where you actually might end up having to run around and you don't really want to run back and forth in the game, even though you might need it because it's not so fun. But if you give the points to the game on the map, for instance, where you can go, that makes it hard for the player to actually enjoy the game world. So there are many interesting challenges in doing that. What you want to focus on is having the player experience the adventure. So you want to have enemies that distract, but maybe not too hard enemies. And many times I think enemies might be too hard. Bosses are hard to design in a good way so that they actually feel boss-like, but don't become these very difficult elements to destroy, and where you have to succeed and you have to repeat many times to be able to take them, because that eventually removes the adventure part of the game and turns it into a reactive, very skill-oriented game where the rest of the entire adventure package doesn't fit so well. So it's a bit of a challenge. Storytelling in general, and now I mean storytelling not in games that are story focused, but in general, for instance, like an action adventure game where the action and exploration are the main components and not necessarily the story. But storytelling is still part of games. To some extent, I think many times there is meaning in the storytelling. So like the advancement of the game character and the advancement of the story is what makes it fundamentally meaningful to continue to play the game, so that the character in the game can reach endpoints and grow and change. And this is something that we like because then we develop it. But the storytelling in itself, long descriptions are not maybe so important. Now, stories can be told in many different ways, so giving names to things, the way things look, the name of places, objects that you find. And the storyline of the development where the character goes from a simple, humble, kind of childlike beginning to a more evolved character later in the game. So I think those things are interesting. So at the same time, we have this conflict between cutscenes, taking long times, or storytelling, droning on with a lot of dialogue that are actually tiresome to consume. And so this is really a difficult challenge. And I think today, maybe more of the story and the lore surrounding a game could actually be placed on YouTube outside of the game experience, where it would not stop the game experience. So you can consume the story at a different time from when you're playing. Because when you're playing, you're in this I want to play mode. And that's why you get the feeling of wanting to skip. A story might have a better fit outside of the game. Now, of course, having said that, there are story-specific games. And I think story games should be super focused on storytelling and interactive fiction rather than trying to add other types of challenges. And maybe a bit more puzzling fits better, of trying to figure out what's actually happened in the game fits better into a story-driven format. But not so common so then we have to also change the game mechanic if we want story to be a primary activity in the game experience. Storytelling also works a bit as a reward system. So having achieved something in the game and getting a small piece of a story is a way to underline the fact that you reached an endpoint and to underline the achievement. Now, the real desire here, motivationally, is not really the story, but the achieving the endpoint, because the biggest and strongest motivation for us is completing sub-challenges, so finishing a level, getting to the end, and then the storytelling there is a way to underline the fact that you actually achieved this, and then the story is a reward. Here, I think it's even more important that the story element is quite short, instead of getting into a phase where you want to skip ahead. And it can be also just an image of a situation in the story that creates enough storytelling to make that story, that piece of the story, into part of the reward system for the game, making the player want to keep on playing, underlining the fact that the players actually achieved something inside. So, having said all these things, I think it's important to think about design as a challenge, where you try your best and you try to make the game as easy to work with as possible. It's important to focus on core aspects, the core mechanics, what kind of a game experience you're trying to create, and how to make your game work with that. How to look for ways that you make it natural for the player to come into the game and get going, and then develop the full game experience. And remember that the player has these different stages where they first want to get excited about the game, then they want to learn the controls, then they want to learn the goals and the reward systems for scoring and picking things up, and then finally they want to learn about more strategic ways to play the game and understand that. and we must follow this kind of process the player has. It takes time, and if we don't deliver our messages at the wrong stage here, people will not pick it up or get confused by it. There is this challenge between players wanting to do things on their own, but they don't want to figure things out. So you have to find ways in order to balance that, to give them enough hints and continue giving them hints, and hints that they can remove. And kind of skip, trying to integrate the story into the world, the instructions into the rewards in the system, where the player is actually doing something, and as a consequence of that, we're actually getting information, as opposed to instructing the player and telling the player to play or how to play. So give it your best try, work with it, test it with players, and try to reiterate and see how far you get. And having said that, I wish you the best of luck.